Hey everybody, welcome to another pre-recorded edition of the Daily Bullet. I'm Paul Lathrop, the Deputy Director of New Media for the Second Amendment Foundation. Joining me today, as they have often in the past, we've had to take a little bit of a break. They had some cases they were working on. I had a thing in Florida I was doing, but I'm awesomely glad to have them back. Alex and Mike Ooley of the Ooley Law Offices in Indiana. Thank you for joining us today, guys.
Thanks for having us again, Paul. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Paul. It's always a pleasure.
So let's get started. I'm going to go off on just a little bit of a tangent here. Our topic today is restoration of rights, and this is, of course, after a felony. In South Dakota, which is the only state I can speak to, I'm not an attorney, but I do know in South Dakota, you can write a check for $250. And if you've only got $230 in your bank account and your check bounces, you could get charged with a felony here in South Dakota as well. The third time you're pulled over for DWI, you get a felony. Now, there are a lot of crimes that are not violent. They're not gun-related. But if you get convicted of a felony, guys, we always say it all the time, felony conviction, man, you're a prohibited person. Is that for life, or is are there possible solutions for people who may have gotten caught behind the eight ball?
Well, that's a great point, Paul, that you raised about just the number of crimes that are punishable as a felony. In fact, there's a book called 3 Felonies a Day that talks about this problem, that there are so many crimes on the books, so many laws against certain actions that oftentimes people don't even know they're committing a crime. And that basically the thesis of this book is that most people commit 3 felonies a day, mostly because they don't even know it. So anyway, I think that's a great point that you raised to start out.
Yeah, the problem is the law has become so complex and so broad that it's become disjointed from our own sense of what's right and wrong, the morals. So people aren't even reasonably appraised of what's wrong, and certainly can be convicted of a felony not even having any malintent whatsoever, of course.
And to your question, Paul, just because someone is convicted of a felony, does that mean they're a prohibited person forever? Does that mean that they've lost their gun rights forever? And the answer is no, not necessarily. The Gun Control Act identifies what would make someone a prohibited person, and one of those provisions is that if you've been convicted in any court of a crime punishable by imprisonment for a term exceeding 1 year, you're a prohibited person. So that would include felonies. But one point I want to make is that a key provision of this is that it says if you have been convicted of a crime punishable by a year. So theoretically, you could have been convicted of a felony, but the sentence would have been less than a year. Nonetheless, you would still be prohibited by this statute because it was punishable by by a year or more. So that's an important point to make starting out. But there are procedures in most states, many states, especially in Indiana. There are procedures that you can follow to restore your gun rights despite having had a conviction for a felony. And I want to point out, too, it's not just felonies that could make you a prohibited person. You could be convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, and that would also make you a prohibited person. So even though it's a misdemeanor, you would still be a prohibited person because it's a crime of domestic violence. Now, with respect to the restoration of your rights, the procedure that you follow is going to be dictated by the state that you live in. There is no expungement procedure in the federal law, or actually there is, but that process hasn't been funded by Congress. So the procedure is there, but they haven't given it any money to fund that process. So if you want to seek restoration of your rights, you're going to have to do it at the state level.
If I could ask then, does that mean if you get convicted of a federal felony that you really are out of luck?
Yeah, unless you can get a pardon. The only procedure at the federal level, if you're convicted of a federal crime, is a pardon. So there is no expungement procedure that you can follow because that program hasn't been funded at the federal level.
There is some good news there, though, and that emanates from the fact that our newest U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, wrote an opinion. I think it was the Cantor opinion in 2019, I think, and it was in a dissent. She wasn't in the majority, but we hope this sort of notion transfers to the U.S. Supreme Court. But she said that she sort of acquiesced that violent felons could have their firearms rights, violent crimes, they could be prohibited. But there was no reason to prohibit non-violent felons from exercising Second Amendment rights and being prohibited to exercise those rights. So she made the distinction between felons and violent felons. And I think that's very important because in the Cantor case, I believe, I'm going off recollection, he was either pled or was convicted. I think he pled to something like mail fraud related to billing of Medicare, something like that. Well, she said that's not a violent felony that the legislature would have the authority to restrict Second Amendment rights on. And I think that's important. So there's some hope there from the Supreme Court that we'll get some relief in this area from the Supreme Court in the future.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, and if you read the opinion, and it's been a while since I read it, but she goes into the history, and she takes an originalist perspective and goes into why felons who have not committed violent felonies should not have their Second Amendment rights lost.
Yeah, and basically she says, I think, that to prohibit nonviolent felons is not a narrowly tailored prescription to protect this important public interest of protecting public safety.
Mm-hmm. But back to your point, Paul, if you are convicted of a felony under federal law, the only relief you have to seek your gun rights back is a pardon, which is almost impossible to get. Mm-hmm. The good news is most felonies occur at the state level and are prosecuted at the state level. So there aren't as many people who are subject to prosecution for federal felonies. And most states have some process to expunge that conviction for a felony or to restore your firearms rights alternatively. They might not. It might be that expungement is the process to restore your rights, or they may have a separate process that's not necessarily expungement to restore your rights. And if it's okay, Paul, I'd like to talk a little bit about Indiana's process just to give people an idea how it works in Indiana and how it may work in other states. I suspect most states have a process that's similar anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
So in Indiana, if you want to have your firearms rights restored, or a number of other civil rights for that matter, the right to vote, the right to serve in public office, or the right to serve on a jury, it's the same sort of procedure for the most part. And the expungement process is going to be dictated primarily by the level of crime that you have been convicted of. So there are, like I said earlier, there are misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence. There are felonies, and there are various levels of felony. In Indiana, the lowest level felony is a level 6 felony. If you want to expunge a level 6 felony, there is a waiting period, and that waiting period is 8 years. So you can't even attempt to restore your gun rights or to get an expungement until you've waited the designated number of years to seek that expungement or to seek your gun rights back. And for the important point here too, with the level of crime, is there's a distinction with the waiting period, but there's also a distinction with the level of discretion that the judge has in deciding whether or not to grant that expungement. So, for instance, if you were convicted of a higher level felony, let's just say a level higher than a level 6, the judge may grant your petition for expungement, does not have to, But if it's a level 6 and you've waited the designated number of years, you haven't committed any other crimes, you've paid all your fines and fees, the judge shall grant your petition. So there's some nuance there, but it's mostly dictated by the level of crime. Now, with respect to misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence, you could have a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence expunged, but that would not restore your gun rights. In Indiana, you have to follow not only the expungement procedure, but a separate procedure. You have to file a petition to restore your gun rights, and it's totally separate from the expungement statute. So if you have a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, you have to file a petition to restore your gun rights. And that would be sufficient if the judge grants it under federal law to make you not a prohibited person, assuming you have no other disqualifications. So that's kind of a quick overview of the process in Indiana. One important thing I want to point out is that you get one shot at this. If you seek an expungement and you use your one shot at an expungement and you are convicted of another crime down the road, you have no more opportunities to get an expungement. So you better make sure it's worthwhile to use up that expungement now rather than wait or use it later, because you lose that opportunity. Anything else you think is important to add? Just that,
as you can see from Alex's summary, much of the law, it can be complicated. And he was talking about Indiana law, so it's going to be if you're in Iowa or South Dakota or wherever you're at, it may be different. So you definitely need to get with an attorney that's familiar with this process. The only thing I'll say is there's been this tension between the federal authorities and state law over the past years about whether the state procedures for expungement are sufficient enough to actually restore your rights under federal law. So that's something you need to absolutely make sure that your attorney is confident that whatever procedure you take under state law, it's actually going to restore your rights.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, in Indiana, this was an issue. Back in 2014, the ATF said that Indiana's expungement process wasn't sufficient to restore your rights under federal law. They didn't think that it actually expunged the records. It just sealed them such that they could actually be used later. So it wasn't a true expungement. But they said if there was an expungement and the language of the statute said that if you had an expungement, it restored your civil rights, then that would be sufficient. So Indiana amended their statute and said that if you gained an expungement, it would restore your civil rights. And that was enough to satisfy the ATF that your rights would be restored not only under Indiana law, but also under federal law. And Paul, we can't hear you. It muted for some reason.
No, it's on my end, guys. It's on my end. Cool. I had a dog barking, and I had to mute the mic for a second. So, and one thing I want to bring up is that this sounds like something that nobody should go through on their own. It sounds complicated enough that should the time arise, take some, put some skin in the game and hire an attorney to do this. I don't think this is something you want to go on your own and try to do.
Yeah, I think this would be a very daunting task for most people who aren't familiar with the court systems and how to find your criminal history and how to make sure that you actually remember you only have one chance at this, in Indiana at least. So to make sure that you get everything expunged that needs to be expunged can sometimes be a difficult task.
Yeah, I even had a conversation with a criminal defense attorney the other day that was not terribly experienced in the firearms area, and she had some questions about this. So it is important that you make sure that you have complete confidence in whatever process you're going through.
And just real quickly, if we have time, Paul,
sure.
Just to take just a minute, I think it would be interesting for folks. When you purchase a firearm, if you're purchasing the firearm through a licensed FFL dealer, you fill out a form 4473. And one of the questions on the form asks, it's question 21C on the new form. I believe they updated the form. And it says, have you ever been convicted in any court of a felony or any other crime for which the judge could have imprisoned you for more than 1 year, even if you received a shorter sentence, including probation? If you've had an expungement, the question is, how do you answer that question? Because you have been convicted. Well, if you read the instructions on the form, it says that if you've had an expungement or your rights restored, that you can honestly answer no to that question. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that's a question that a lot of people have that's would be interesting for folks.
I know we get that question.
Yeah.
So, and we are coming up on the time we have, but the last few times we've had you on, there's been rumblings and there's been some movement. Is constitutional carry coming to Indiana?
We sure hope so, Paul, but we're not out of the woods yet. It passed the House pretty overwhelmingly.
Oh, yeah, in the upper 60s to the. It was like almost 2-1 in the House of Representatives. The House. I'm sorry, Alex.
It was assigned to a committee in the Senate, but it hasn't come to a vote in the Senate. The Senate has to give it a hearing. They have to have an opportunity to discuss the bill, and they haven't done that yet. We hope I believe there are 2 more chances for it to get assigned a hearing, and we hope that it gets assigned a hearing. But as each day ticks away, we're getting a little more and more concerned that it won't get a hearing.
So if you're a Hoosier out there, please email, write, call your state senator and ask him or her to support giving House Bill 1369 a hearing in the Senate committee that it's assigned to and a full vote in the Senate. I don't mean to sound like a preacher, but to me, it's nothing wrong with sounding like a preacher, by the way. That's a good thing. This thing passed overwhelmingly in the House. It seems to me a real sin if it doesn't get an up or down vote in the Senate. And I think what we have is a lot of senators, once again, who want to say they're pro-Second Amendment when the next election comes around, but they don't want to go on the record during this session and either vote up or down on constitutional carry in Indiana. If they don't support it, they need to go on the record and say, I don't support constitutional carry, so their constituents know.
Yeah, I would agree with it. We have some issues with that in South Dakota as well. People that that say, look, I support this or I support that, but when it comes to getting an up or down, moving to an up or down vote in either the House or the Senate, it depends. Yeah. You'll get them not really wanting to send that out of committee because that puts them on record.
And they want to keep that A rating from the NRA, and if they don't have to vote, it won't hurt the A rating. So,
yeah, and the NRA A rating. How do I? Harry Reid had an NRA A rating. Yeah. I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay, point taken.
All right, gentlemen, we are totally out of time, but I want to thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. We appreciate it. And thank you for your work.
Yes, sir. Folks, if you would, please subscribe to the channel, and when you do, hit the notification bell so you know when we release another episode. And as all of these are going to be now, this will be attached to the live episode that airs on the 27th of March on Friday. Thanks for watching. Join us tomorrow at 12 noon Central Time for the Weekly Bullet. Thanks again for watching.